This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell is going on in Washington?
What the hell is going on is that the world is on fire. We've got Russia started a war in Europe. We've got Iran has started a war in the Middle East. China's threatening a war in the Pacific. And we're reliving the 1930s today. And a bunch of GOP isolationists, just like in the 1930s, are absolutely embarrassing their party and paralyzing Washington. And I'm sorry, we don't have time for this stupidity. We could be on the brink of World War III. I mean, imagine if China decided this is the moment, right? America's distracted by it, especially like, let's say this thing escalates to some where like Iran starts striking, killing Americans, which they're getting pretty damn close to doing because their proxies are firing at U.S. bases, firing at U.S. ships, and something hits. And all of a sudden we have to strike back at Iran. And all of a sudden we're in a skirmish of some kind bordering on a conflict in the Middle East. And China says, you know what? Perfect time. Let's go for Taiwan. I mean, this could happen. I hope it doesn't, but I mean, it's not like our deterrence posture seems to be working so well since we failed to deter a war in Europe and we failed to deter a war in the Middle East. Why can't we fail to deter a war in the Pacific? And we've got a bunch of guys who literally call themselves America First. Boy, this could be the biggest mistake in branding ever if this thing blows out of control. And then holding the entire House of Representatives hostage. And we can't get a speaker elected and literally forget aid to Israel, forget aid to Ukraine. They have not passed a resolution condemning Hamas's attack on Israel. I mean, how absolutely pathetic is the Republican Party?
So I actually think that the America First line is completely apt because, of course, that is what the group in the 1930s called themselves that were humiliated in the face of reality. I like what you call those guys the Lindbergh caucus.
Here's what I might call Matt Gaetz. Matt Gaetz is Charles Lindbergh without the pilot's license.
And let's face it, without the brains. These are people, I have said this and I will keep saying this, these are people who believe that they were elected to the House of Representatives to be trolls. We were talking today to a member of Congress who's not a troll, who's one of the co-chairs of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus. And one of the things that he says, I think, is something we need to talk about because we have focused very, very clearly on these 8, and there are more, but there are 8 ringleaders in this Matt Gaetz-led group in the GOP who don't do anything, who don't pass legislation, who don't have ideas, who don't view themselves as anything other than destructionists, as people who are there to bring the House down, who are there to stop legislation from passing, but don't have counter legislation of their own. What I think I didn't focus on as much is just how culpable the Democratic Party is here as well. And I say that not as a partisan matter. Look, the Republicans own the idiots that they have put before the electorate. And I don't want to exculpate them. I don't want to get them off the hook in any way. But I got to say, if I were in the House of Representatives, I would vote for a decent speaker, even if I was a Democrat and the Republicans held the majority. What I don't understand is why Hakeem Jeffries, who is the Democratic leader in the House, wants to be complicit in this, wants to see this paralysis, wants to basically watch the world burn because, hey, makes my party look good. Dude, no, it doesn't.
Well, also, it's completely not in his self-interest. So, I mean, the Democrats control the White House, they control the Senate, and all that they don't control is the House of Representatives. But there is a majority to pass some of their priorities, like this package that Biden has put forward to aid Ukraine, aid Israel, aid Taiwan, do some border security. This is like, there's a bipartisan majority to do that, which is supposedly president's priority. If Kevin McCarthy were speaker, we'd be passing that. If you're looking at it from a Democratic perspective, why would you not want to have a speaker who just proved that he's willing to like buck his party and keep the government open by passing a bipartisan bill
because
and
for
pass your
him,
agenda? It's
because
like
for him, because for him, his ugly secret that is simply concealed behind the antics, the circus-like behavior of the GOP, his ugly secret is he's enjoying it. This makes commercials. When I have, sat on a bunch of TV panels recently, and one thing that...
Because you're very famous.
I am extraordinarily famous, as everybody knows. And in each one, we talk about this. And what the reporters all make clear is, oh, no, the Democrats are loving this. This is the commercial maker. This is going to be great for the next election. And it's like, you know something? That's not actually your job. Your job, as I have said repeatedly about the Republicans, is to represent your constituency and lead this country. This is a branch of our government, damn it. I watch all of these idiots and I despair. Why can't we have nice things, America?
Yeah. And I'll tell you, you mentioned the line about watch the world burn. That's more of I draw that more towards the Gates crowd, because they have no plan except to watch the world burn. The line comes from the movie The Dark Knight, which I know you're such a fan of superhero movies, Danny.
I love those movies.
But it's there's Arthur is talking to Bruce Wayne, and Bruce Wayne is doesn't understand why the bad guys are doing what they're doing, and he says to him, some people just want to watch the world burn. And that's literally where these 8 idiots are. They just want to watch the GOP burn and tear the whole thing down. And there's so much, and it would be one thing if this was like 1991, 1992, the Cold War had just ended, there was peace, we were the unilateral superpower in the world, there was no great power challenges to us, we were at the end of history, and we were in this unipolar moment, and we wanted to just blow everything up in Washington. Okay, fine. No, we're in a period of the worst crises that our country has faced on the world stage, and by the way, on our freaking border, where you've had just to put this in perspective. We have had every year of the Biden administration the largest number of encounters at the southern border. Every year successively, we break the record, which is in encounters. For people who don't follow this stuff, it's like that's the metric, because if you're encountering people, that you're assuming that a lot more people are coming than the ones you're encountering, right? And they have calculated, they know of 1.5 million gotaways who have come into this country. Think about what that means. So right now at the border, if you turn yourself into Border Patrol, you're going to get to stay, right? So why would you be a gotaway? Because you're a criminal, you're a murderer, you've got fentanyl, or you're a terrorist. We've caught more, I think 300 people on the terror watch list in the last 3 years at the border. And out of the 1.5 million gotaways, how many more are there? This could all come back to us. We could come full circle back to 9/11 again.
I want to share some statistics that Clara put together for us, because to me they were, and this is not my area, so I don't focus on it every day. And I was just like, I was shocked. My jaw dropped when I looked at the numbers. So under Biden, Immigration and Customs Enforcement has arrested 48% fewer convicted criminals at the border, deported 63% fewer criminals, issued 46% fewer detainer requests to other law enforcement agencies. So, when bad guys come in, the FBI may turn to Customs Enforcement, or police may turn to them, or they may turn to, so down by half. And on deportations, they recorded 39,149 convicts removed in 2021. Now, that number by itself is so unbelievable, but that is down 62% compared to the year before, with 2020, when 103,762 convicts were ousted. Guys, these are people who've already been convicted of a crime. The fentanyl numbers are going to knock your socks off. 634 pounds of fentanyl was taken and 12,500 pounds of methamphetamine. When? In February of 2022. As the coverage I read wrote, this is enough to kill every man, woman, and child in this country. This is just nuts. You guys know I'm super pro immigration, but not this, not illegal immigration, and not, honestly, I have to say it. This is an open border.
It's 100% an open border. So we've got enemies attacking on two fronts and threatening on a third front, and an open border. And oh, by the way, unprecedented 40-year high inflation. I mean, gas prices are still hovering at $4. People can't afford it. Literally, if you want to buy a house, the value of your dollar has been cut in half. I mean, so people can't buy homes, can't afford food. The whole place
Now
is
is
falling
the time
apart.
to act like a jackass, right, in Congress.
And Matt Gaetz is running the country.
Yep,
And
exactly.
I mean, that's where we are. I mean, good Lord,
Well,
that's what's happening. My God.
Let's bring on our guest because he says it succinctly and he lives it every day. Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick.
So we don't have to.
Thank God. Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, first time with us, and you guys are going to be super impressed with him because I know we really were. He represents Pennsylvania's 1st District in the 118th Congress, which is this Congress, the Do-Nothing Congress. Congressman Fitzpatrick sits on the Ways and Means Committee and HPSC, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He also co-chairs the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus and the Congressional Ukraine Caucus. He is a former FBI special agent and federal prosecutor.
Who actually was working in Ukraine and so understands Ukraine as an FBI agent. He's one of my favorite members of Congress. He's got his head on straight and he's got courage of his convictions, which is awesome because he's standing up to Gaetz and the 8 know-nothings. Here's our interview. Congressman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be with you.
So glad to have you. So Russia's just started a war in Europe. Iran has started a war in the Middle East. China is threatening a war in the Pacific, and the House can't elect a speaker. What the hell is going on?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Mark. I will tell you, Kevin McCarthy should have never been vacated. The fact that, we always knew that there would be, a handful within the Republican conference that were threatening, that if he did anything for the good of the country, anything in a bipartisan manner, that they would try to hold him accountable, quote unquote. What we never expected, never anticipated, was that 208 Democrats, every single last one of them that voted that day, all of whom voted for the bill that Speaker McCarthy put on the floor to avert a shutdown, would then turn around 3 days later and remove the person who put the bill on the floor that they themselves voted for to avert a shutdown. We could have never anticipated that. I, for one, never expected it. It is totally outrageous and unacceptable. So everything that we're going through right now, and I said this before the shutdown, Mark, I said, we had obviously an ongoing conflict in Ukraine. We need to get a Ukraine package passed. We're now a few weeks out, according to DOD's estimates, on when they're really going to start feeling the lack of funding from the U.S. We now have a war in Israel. We have a government that's going to run out of money on the federal side in 27 days. We have 30 dead Americans in Israel. We have, dozens missing in Gaza. And we have an entire branch of government offline. So, the blame falls squarely with the 8 and the 208. And you can proportion that out to those numbers as to why we're in the situation we're in right now. We're going to try to fix that this week. Unfortunately, it's been 2 weeks now plus without a solution. I wish our Democrat colleagues would come to the table and help us out a little bit, but so far not the case. But we're going to keep working at it.
So welcome to the podcast, Congressman. It's really nice to have you. And as I said before we started, enormously timely. I was on Meet the Press yesterday, and one of our guests was Kevin McCarthy. Mm-hmm. That is an angry, angry man, and rightfully so, given what you describe. What I don't understand, though, we know the 8. I mean, and you don't have to agree with my characterization and you don't have to associate with it, but these are people who live for the chaos. These are people who got elected to be trolls in the U.S. political system from my perspective. What I don't understand is why there aren't not 200, not 205, but why there aren't just a few people who you work with in the Problem Solvers Caucus who want to see Congress be serious. Why?
That's a great question, Danielle, and that's a question that I would urge you to pose to them, just like I do with the entire D.C. press corps. I asked them this very question. Are you asking, the 8 Republicans and the 208 Democrats, or if you want to narrow it down, some of the more moderate members of the Democrat conference, whether they're proud of this outcome, whether if Hamas had stormed Israel the day before the motion to vacate, would they have voted the same way? I don't think they would, which I think tells the whole story. So is Speaker McCarthy upset? Of course he is. And should he be? Of course he should be. Danielle, he put a 2-party solution on the floor to, number one, save us from falling over the fiscal cliff by raising the debt ceiling, number one. And that's where the initial threat came from extreme right of the Republican conference. And then he put a 2-party bill on the floor to avert a government shutdown, which every last Democrat voted for, save one, I believe. Mike Quigley, because it did not include Ukraine funding. And they all voted for it. We averted a shutdown, and they punished him for putting a 2-party bill on the floor. So, of course, he's upset, as he should be. Danielle, there were members of the Democrat conference that told Kevin McCarthy personally, told many of us personally, and my colleagues that they would never do this, that they would never side with any extreme members of the Republican conference to punish the speaker for doing something that they themselves agreed he should do. And they went back on that. So that's a question for them. I think every member of the press ought to be asking them that question, because the blame for what we're going through right now, having an entire branch of government offline when the world is on fire, when 2 wars are raging, and all of the other dangers that I just talked about, they got to be held accountable, and they got to be part of the solution here to fix it and then undo what they did.
Well, it's also shooting themselves in the foot. I mean, it's the president's priority to get aid to Ukraine, and there's a majority in that bipartisan majority in the House to do that. But when you kick McCarthy out and there's no speaker, then you can't do that. So
No
I mean, why?
question about
It's
it.
in their own self-interest.
Of course, Mark. There's 3 things that make no sense that they can't explain. If they want to support Israel, which we need to do, if they want to support Ukraine, which we need to do, and if they want to fund the government now in 26, 27 days, which we need to do, then the decision to remove Speaker McCarthy runs counter to all 3 of those goals, right? So, yes, they need to answer this question. I don't think they anticipated what we were warning them of, which is if you do this, because Kevin McCarthy was holding that Republican conference together with duct tape and silly putty. That is not an easy group to hold together with a very slim margin. You got a lot of different factions within the GOP. They knew that, and yet I don't think even they anticipated that we would essentially be shutting the government down. Ironically, 2 days after we kept it open by bringing that very bipartisan bill to the floor, by vacating them, they shut the government down. The lights are off on the House of Representatives. We can't even go to the House floor and condemn Hamas right now. We can't even do it because of the 8 and the 208 that decided to shut down one branch of government.
Why can't we do that? So Congressman McHenry is the Speaker pro tem, and that position was created as a continuity of government measure after 9/11. If the speaker was incapacitated or unavailable, the Speaker pro tem would step in. Well, when the president's incapacitated and the vice president assumes the powers of the presidency, he has the full powers of the presidency. How is it continuity of government? I mean, I guess the question is, where the hell is the continuity of government?
Yes. And Mark, it poses a lot of interesting and novel questions. Clearly, this was a precedent-setting event. We've never been in this situation ever before. And as you pointed out, this whole concept was created post 9/11 for continuity of government. It is the opinion of Patrick McHenry. It is Republican. It's the opinion of the Democrat chairman of the Rules Committee, Mr. McGovern, and of the parliamentarian, that the Speaker pro tem only has the authority to call a new speaker vote. I do not know whether that is in fact an accurate or inaccurate interpretation, but all 3 of them seem to share that view, which would require us, which I am supportive of, by the way, to have a House vote to clarify that provision that was passed shortly after 9/11 to empower Speaker Pro Tem McHenry to at least allow us to bring, essential bills to the floor having to do with government funding, national security, and the like.
In despair at the prospects for working this out, and I'm going to come back toward the end and ask you whether you think there's some fail-safe solution here, but something that interests me a great deal, and I haven't gotten a great answer to it. You are the chairman or the co-chairman of the Congressional Ukraine Caucus. Thank you for doing that. Mark and I have made no secret of our perspective on this question and of the imperative of defeating Vladimir Putin. What is the origin? Where has this strange anti-Reagan-esque idea that Ukraine is somehow just a sideshow, useless, we should never be supporting them? Where has this come from, and why has it got such purchase? Not just among the lunatics or the exotics, as some of my friends call them, but increasingly among the mainstreams of the Republican Party. Why?
Yeah, that's a very, very astute question, Danielle. And it's one that everybody should be talking about. You both know, both you and Mark know as students of politics, that the liberal wing of the Democrat Party and the libertarian wing of the Republican Party sort of arc together when it comes to national security. I would say one is always historically weak and the other historically naive. There is a libertarian bent that is creeping into the GOP perspective, which is very isolationist in its foreign affairs, foreign policy, which I believe is incredibly dangerous. I am a Reagan Republican. I believe in number one, his approach was appealing to the better angels of people's nature. He was inclusive. He was aspirational. He understood of the importance of peace through strength. And he led America through one of the greatest eras in the 1980s, the era of Hands Across America, the era where we were all united against the Soviet Union. It was such a patriotic time in our nation's history, and we really need to get back to that, not just as a Republican Party, but as a country. And we don't have that right now because there is a libertarian bent creeping into the Republican conference. But I also will tell you this, Danielle, this is largely politics. I can tell you with every vote, every Ukraine vote that comes up on the floor, there are a lot of people that are in the camp of vote no and hope yes. Nowhere is that more prevalent than in Ukraine. So if we had, say, 100 members out of 222 in the Republican conference that voted against the Ukraine funding measure, I would reckon 85 of those 100 didn't even agree with their own vote. But they feel political pressure because of certain aspects of conservative media that have had a disparate influential impact amongst their constituents back home, that they are fearful of that vote. Now, some of them are trying to nuance it, saying we want transparency. Well, of course we all want transparency. Of course we do. In fact, me and Mike Quigley, two of the co-chairs of the Ukraine caucus, introduced just that. It's called the Pact with Ukraine Act. It has a partnership and cooperative transparency concept. It establishes institutions, reporting requirements. We all want transparency. We all want that. But we also want Ukraine, a freedom-loving democracy, a democratically elected government, to not be victims of genocide anymore and to be able to stand up to and defeat, an evil genocidal regime of Vladimir Putin, because it matters not just for Ukraine, it matters for Taiwan, it matters for freedom-loving nations across the world. This is not just about Ukraine. It's about freedom. That's what it's about.
So I can't tell you how distressing that is to hear that members are voting no and thinking yes. There's no question. The House of Representatives, the Congress, overall, these are people elected to represent. That's what the word means, for sure. But on foreign policy, there has always been a requirement for leadership. Mark and I both worked for the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I remember going to him on multiple occasions and saying, hey, important constituents don't want you to do this. Important constituents don't believe in this. And I still have a memo where he wrote back to me, and he wrote in his characteristically blue pen, he wrote, sometimes you just have to say no. What's happened to that character? What's happened to that leadership? What's happened to standing up to fringe radio and cable weirdos? I don't get it.
Yeah, well, you and me both, Danielle, and I agree with you. Politics and campaigning have changed so much. Gone are the days when we grew up where you had an hour or two of Walter Cronkite every night, and then you went about your business. Now people have news, quote unquote news, which is cable news, which oftentimes is more editorializing than it is news, on their television 24 hours a day. And they turn on the channel that validates their pre-existing beliefs rather than cross-examining their existing paradigms. That's problem number one. Social media is another aspect of it. If you had this odd conspiratorial view back in the 1980s, you were sort of on an island on your own. Now you can find an entire community of people that share those beliefs, which then provide an incentive to act out. And also, Danielle, I would say the fact that only 7 out of 50 states in America have open primaries or some version thereof is a huge problem, because you combine factors 1 and 2 that I just mentioned with saber-rattling politicians that are on the rise these days, and you couple that with closed primaries, which 43 out of 50 states have. That leads to a lot of these members voting no and hoping yes, or vice versa. I can tell you this was the case with the government shutdown. I can't tell you, Danielle, how many members came up to me on the floor and said, Fitz, we need your problem solvers to bail us out here. We need you to sign the discharge petition. These are Republican members of Congress, right? Who wanted us to do what they probably would have criticized us in public for doing, but it would have provided them with an escape hatch to not have the problem fall in their lap politically. That's happening a lot. And it's happening because of certain personalities, both on the left and the right, that have a disparate impact over constituents. It's a problem. And I think we need structural reform. I think we need open primaries. I think we need term limits. All these things would make these bad factors that are leading to bad results go away.
So in July, Matt Gaetz got just 70 votes for his amendment to cut off aid to Ukraine. 2/3 of the Republican caucus voted against him. And then a few months later, 117 Republicans voted against aid to Ukraine. That's a 47 vote swing, more than half of the Republican caucus. One, what happened in that short period of time? Is that really where the caucus is in terms of if we had an up or down vote on Ukraine aid in normal circumstances, that's where they would be? Or was that some weird dynamic going on with the government shutdown at the time? And, if these guys really want the aid to happen, but they just don't want to be responsible for voting for it, I mean, what's going to happen with Ukraine aid in this context?
Where we were always going to be headed with Speaker McCarthy, he saved us from the debt ceiling. He pursued a bipartisan path with President Biden. He saved us from a government shutdown, pursued a bipartisan path somewhat with the Senate. We were always going to have then because Ukraine funding was not in the CR. Disaster relief was, Ukraine was not. We were going to marry together, and Lindsey Graham talked about this. He and I were on Face the Nation the same day, one segment apart. And he talked about a border funding bill with a Ukraine funding bill. Bring them together. Everybody wants both. The Democrats want border funding. They're afraid to say it. Republicans want Ukraine funding. They're afraid to say it. And by the way, I am telling you from an eyewitness testimony on the floor, they're all telling me this. Democrats, particularly from New York, are like, can you save us from this? Get a border bill passed. We want it to pass. We just can't say it. Same with the Republicans on Ukraine. As Danielle pointed out, this is utterly ridiculous. So this goes on, but this is the reality of what we're dealing with. That was always the plan. So how do we get it done now? I think this is exactly how we do it. We marry it with border funding for our own southern border, and we get it done. And also, Mark, Democrat and Republican colleagues. So I walked over to the Senate that Saturday night after we passed that government funding bill in the House and was talking to a lot of our colleagues in the Senate, Democrat and Republican, who all said the same thing, that they don't like having to take these Ukraine votes every couple of weeks or every couple of months. They said, we got to do one massive bill with transparency, with border funding that gets us through the election. So to your earlier question, why did the number go from 70 to 100 plus? It's because people are having increasingly more difficulty explaining their vote back home. If they just had to do one vote, maybe if it was buried into something else, it would be easier politically for them. But they don't like having to take a Ukraine vote every couple of months. It's very challenging for them.
That's absolutely right. And we've criticized the living daylights out of the Biden administration because this is a reflection of their own hesitation in supporting Ukraine in the long term. This is why they've had a day late, dollar short policy. But one of the things that was super interesting to me, Congressman, was that in the supplemental that they sent up with money for Israel, with money for Ukraine, with money for the Palestinians, there is more money for the border than there is for humanitarian aid for the Palestinians. Okay. And yes, that's not enough, but it was more than $10 billion. And it was a recognition, at least, that these issues need to be tied together. That sounds to me like an opening, a possibility that one could move forward. What's going to happen? Is the Senate just going to move that and let it drop like a poop into the punch bowl of the House?
Yeah, well, that remains to be seen, Danielle. All I know is that we got to get this done. We have to get a speaker elected. We have to fund our government in 27 days. We have to support Ukraine. We have to support Israel. We have to support Taiwan. We have to do all of these things. There is overwhelming bipartisan consensus in the House and the Senate to do everything that I just mentioned. It's the politics that's getting in the way of it. So any way that I can be helpful, and I've told my colleagues this, they can pin the blame on me and my moderate colleagues as much as they want. We're used to it. We'll deal with that again. But I will tell you, Danielle, I was an FBI agent before I was in Congress. My last assignment was in Ukraine. I spent so much time working Russian counterintelligence in the Bureau, trying to stave off what happened in February several years ago. It was absolutely heartbreaking, gut punch for me to see that actually happen. Mitch McConnell was on Face the Nation this past weekend, and I agree with what he said. He said, no Americans are getting killed in Ukraine. We're rebuilding our industrial base. The Ukrainians are destroying the army of one of our biggest rivals. And he said, I have a hard time finding anything wrong with that. Ukraine is doing the work for the world right now. And I don't know what the controversy is in supporting them, not to mention the fact that they're fighting for their own territorial integrity, which America has to stand for. If we don't lead in that regard, it's just like the bully in the schoolyard that we all grew up with. Appeasement gets you more bullying. Standing up to the bully makes it end.
You talked about the defense spending for a second here. I mean, one of the things that we found, we're doing some research on this at AEI, is that 90% of the military aid isn't going to Ukraine. It's going to Americans.
100%.
It's going to, either to build weapons for Ukraine or to replenish the stockpiles of the weapons that we've given them from our, excess capacity.
100%. And many of them are loans to NATO too, right?
Yeah. And so I'm going through the list right now, and I'm looking at, the JDAM-ER, which is a new weapon that's being built that was just for Ukraine. It's being built in St. Charles, Missouri, which is the home of Josh Hawley. The Abrams tanks that are going to Poland and to Ukraine, being built in Lima, Ohio, which is Jim Jordan's district and J.D. Vance's state. You can go to Alabama. Tommy Tuberville and Katie Britt voted against Ukraine aid. That's one of the states that's getting the most Ukraine aid sent to it. Where's the disconnect where I thought members liked pork. When did we suddenly become against bringing home the bacon for manufacturing workers in our states?
Yeah, it's far-right talk radio. It's far-right, television hosts that are scaring the living bejesus out of constituents, with some conspiratorial things that, somehow this money's getting siphoned off elsewhere. And by the way, none of us want that. None of us want that. Anybody needs to say, any member of Congress that wants to support Ukraine but wants transparency, we are 100% on board with that. We have a bipartisan bill. It's called the Pact with Ukraine Act. It provides massive, robust transparency to make sure. Of course, we want every dime to be going to its intended target. But to say we should just abandon Ukraine on the battlefield and let them get slaughtered and have Russia take over Ukraine, and they're not going to stop there. They've said it themselves. And not to mention what the impacts are on Israel, on South Korea, on Greece, on Taiwan, all the other countries that are in the crosshairs of some other either dictator or aspiring dictator. Mark, I'm going to continue to do my job in the conference. The thing that we should all be rest assured with is the people on the committees of jurisdiction on the Republican side, Mike McCall on Foreign Affairs, Mike Turner on Intelligence, Mike Rogers on Armed Services, all support Ukraine. And that's a good thing. It's these, other rank and file members that are raising a lot of hell over this that we just got to talk to and work something out with and get it done. I think if we put a Ukraine funding bill that gets us through the election, tied to border security, get this done with, and that way we can move on.
What about the next speaker? Are you guys going to hold firm that you're not going to, we just had the 8 knuckleheads who sided with the Democrats to bring down Kevin McCarthy. Are the pro-defense, pro-Ukraine Republicans going to allow a speaker to be elected who's going to not pass that funding bill?
Well, I can tell you it's a red line for me. That's for sure. And the other beauty, Mark, of having a 4, soon to be a 3 vote margin in the House is that we're all Joe Manchin, right? A very small group of us can sign a discharge petition on any given day to get any certain legislative initiative a floor vote, and it will pass. So we have a lot of tools at our disposal. So when I was over in the Baltics just before Speaker McCarthy was vacated, I went to Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. I went to Finland and Sweden, our newest NATO entry, Finland, and hopefully soon Sweden and the Baltic states. I said to every single one of them that this is a red line for me in a lot of different ways because I know what's at stake. I will use the power of my position and my voice in Congress to make sure that we do not allow Ukraine to get slaughtered on the battlefield, that we give them what they need. And by the way, I also need to criticize the administration. I'm glad that they are providing support as opposed to some people that want to cut support off altogether. But Mark, I'm not sure what their strategy is here. If it's just to keep Ukraine in the fight, or is it to give them enough to actually win? There were a number of us that went to Poland 2 weeks after the invasion. I was with Greg Meeks and Mike McCall, the chairman and ranking member of Foreign Affairs. We were there with Secretary Blinken. And back then, we were begging the administration to give MiG-29s, TB-2 drones, S-300 surface-to-air missiles, all Soviet technology. And they were saying no. And fast forward now, they have ATACMS, they have Patriots. I mean, all the things that were completely off limits on day one are now being given. And could you imagine, Mark and Danielle, if we would have given them all this equipment on day one, how much better of a position they would have been in?
But just the medium range ATACMS.
Of course.
We haven't given them the long range ones. We're only giving them the 100-mile version.
Yeah.
I mean, even now, they still are just slow rolling. Good Lord, take the gloves off and beat this guy.
So when I look at the position of the far right versus the administration, I say one's bad and the other's worse.
Yep.
None of them are good on this.
That's for damn sure, unfortunately. It's a race to the bottom that we're enjoying right now. So exit question for me, and it's the hard one. A two-parter. Let's make it this. Are there Republicans who are talking to Hakeem Jeffries, who are talking to the Democrats about leadership and how to solve this problem? Are there Republicans who are talking to the White House about leaning on the Democrats to help? That's part one. Part two, honestly speaking, you're sitting up there. I know this is a really tough one, but how's this gonna work out?
So the answer to your first question is yes, and I'm one of them. So that's the answer to that question.
Thank you for being a grown up.
And I've spoken to Leader Jeffries and several members of the Democrat conference, and I'm the chair of the problem solvers, so I speak to my colleagues there all the time. Albeit we're very, very disappointed that they did not vote present on the motion to table. Something that I can tell you, and I said in advance on national television, that if Hakeem Jeffries were ever speaker and he put a two-party solution on the floor that I voted for, I would never side with a member of the squad who attempted to vacate him for doing so. I would never do that. So I expect the same out of my Democrat colleagues. Where does this end? We're going to continue to push to empower Speaker McHenry to at least be able to function in a manner that we think he has the authority to do already. He and others have claimed they don't, and he's not willing to go further than what he thinks he has the authority to do. But to empower him to basically act as acting speaker for the remainder of the year or even the remainder of the cycle, I would be fine with that. Patrick McHenry is a solid member of Congress. He's smart. He's a great negotiator. I'd be honored to have him as speaker. But we need help here, Danielle. We need some Democrat colleagues, some moderate Democrats or beyond that, to help us here. Because in a 4-3 vote margin, depending on attendance in any given day, we have an outcome determinative number of fringe elements of the chamber that are going to just stall and burn the place down. So, we need people to come to the center. And, as much it might be politically tempting for the Democrats to just watch the House flail right now, that's not good for the country. It's not. And I can tell you 100%, Danielle, that if the shoe were on the other foot, I would be the first one reaching out to them, not waiting for them to come to me, but but reaching out to them and saying, how can I help? This is hurting our country. It's a very dangerous situation.
So here's a question from me. How much is the disaster on the border not just hurting the country, because it's obviously hurting the country, 1.5 million gotaways, people on the terror watch list getting caught coming in. I mean, it's a national security and other disaster. But how much is it undermining Ukraine? The talking point you keep hearing from the anti-Ukraine Republicans is Biden cares more about Ukraine's border than ours. Yep. And they're not wrong about it. And the problem is it great to put together a package of border security funding, but it's not a funding problem. And it's not even a legislative authority problem because Biden has all the same laws on the books that Trump did. And by the way, that Obama did when he was the deporter in chief. And they secured the border. So it's a question of presidential will to just use the law and authorities he has on the books now. If he can't do that, I mean, over time, are we just going to lose? Is Zelensky going to pay the price for Biden's unwillingness to do his job and secure the border?
As always, Mark, well said by you. You've nailed
it.
Thank you. And there's hypocrisy across the board, and that's unfortunately what we're seeing on a regular basis now. I don't know why he doesn't secure the border, Mark. He has all the authorities, as you pointed out. He has people like us that are willing to give him any authorities he claims he doesn't have. If he needs a Title 42 without the public health emergency, we have a large bipartisan bloc that would be more than willing to give that to him. There's only one possible explanation. He can't see it and think it's smart, right? There's only one plausible explanation. He's fearful of the progressive wing of his party, who are completely unreasonable on this and several other issues, just like the far right is entirely unreasonable on a whole host of issues in their own regard. So, I don't know the answer to it, Mark. All I can tell you is I have a lot, just like I had Republican colleagues tell me, Get Ukraine funding done, take it off my plate. Get the government funding done, take it off my plate. I have a lot of Democrat colleagues saying, get the border secure. We want it. We can't be out there being outspoken about it because of all the dynamics that they have to deal with within their own party and their own base. But that's what we're hearing. We hear all these whispers on the House floor from both sides on the Ukraine and the border issue.
Just amazing. Such profiles and courage on both sides.
Yeah, no
Absolutely.
kidding. No kidding.
Thank you for being courageous. Thank you for showing leadership, and thank you for caring about all these important things. And thank you for joining us. This was amazing.
Well, I want to thank both of you, Danielle, Mark, for your intellectual consistency, your intellectual honesty. It's a currency that's in rare form these days, unfortunately. And it's the only thing that's really going to save our country. Believe me, we are, and I know you both know this, we are so blessed to live in the greatest country that's ever been formed. And it's a country that's done more good for more people and more nations than any other nation ever has and any other nation ever will. We're 247 years into this experiment. The only thing that will save us is we got to fight back against this hyper-partisan saber rattling where Americans are focused more on anger towards our fellow citizens because a box they checked on their voter registration form when they're 18, rather than focusing on the common enemy that we did in the 80s. When I grew up, right? The Soviet Union was something we all rallied around as a country to fight against. Now we're spending more time fighting each other. And I just want to thank you for the voice that you're lending to our country, one of common sense, and you're not partisan. You're not ideological. You're just purely driven by facts and evidence and the law. And I want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you. That's made my day. I appreciate it. And thank you for being part of this show. We really, and for your leadership on the Hill, where it's so needed.
You bet. Thank you.
So, Mark, what do you think?
So here's what I take away from I took away a lot from that interview because, first of all, thank God we have some people like Brian Fitzpatrick still in Congress, because that gives me a little bit of hope that there's some sanity and people who are willing to stand up and actually not just turtle, but in the face of this idiocy, but actually push back. But what I was shocked about was how many people are turtling. The fact that he says, when there's a vote on Ukraine, the vast majority of the people who are voting against the Ukraine aid really want it to pass. They just don't have the courage of their convictions to stand up for what they're saying. And they tell him privately, I hope it passes. And then the number of Democrats who are saying, we got to get this border under control, but I can't vote for it. So I think Republicans, pass some border security like that. It's like, I'm sorry, what the hell were you elected to Congress to do? You weren't elected to Congress to be popular. I mean, there used to be a time when people were willing to stand up for their principles, even and lose their seats if it was important enough, to do something. And on neither of these things should you be losing your seat. It's not like there is a groundswell of anti-Ukraine sentiment in the Republican Party. It's, the most, if you look at the polls, we had Roger Zakheim on it earlier this year with the Reagan Institute poll, and about half of Republicans want to continue aid, but a supermajority think that Russia's the bad guy and Ukraine's the good guy and want to help. It's just nobody's explaining to them why we need to help. So it's like when Biden pulled out of Afghanistan. Were there marches in the streets from people demanding that we withdraw from Afghanistan, end this war? That nobody was. Nobody wanted to pull out of Afghanistan. They sort of did. If you ask a poll, saying, yeah, we should probably be done with this whole thing. I wish it was over. I also wish that I won the lottery. There's no groundswell against any of this, and they're self-deterring because they're idiots.
Yeah. No, look, I mean, we have such a vacuum of leadership. We are so bankrupt, and this really on both sides of the aisle, bankrupt in courage. We have such a courage deficit here in this country among our would-be leaders. It's so terribly disappointing. And I will tell you what underscores that. It is when you talk to someone who's good, who's smart. And something, there are times when it's not right to be bipartisan. There are times when, for example, you shouldn't support what the president wants to do because what the president wants to do, as in your perfect example, right? Withdraw from Ukraine, give more money to the UN. There are things where the Republican Party ought to stand firm and tall, right? We shouldn't be kowtowing to the Iranians or the Chinese. We should be doing much more. So absolutely stand tall. But these guys aren't standing tall for anything. These guys aren't standing tall to, as you rightly said in our introduction, they're not for anything. They're just against. And, it reminds me a little, and we actually have a completely different conversation that we will be releasing next week about anti-Semitism. But it really reminds me because, of course, our guest says anti-Semitism is one of the pure antis. You're just against these people, right? These 8 guys and their fellow travelers, right, on the Hill who vote with them but aren't as loud as them. They're just against. They don't stand for anything in America except destruction.
Yeah. I want to leave on an encouraging note. And what I've despaired at is watching Matt Gaetz and his band of know-nothings who have they're effectively legislative terrorists. They've terrorized the entire Republican caucus. They're in power for one reason, because their faction is so stupid. They nominated so many people who couldn't win elections that they left winnable races on the floor in the 2022 midterms. And as a result, we only have a 4-person majority, which ironically has empowered them, because if we had a 20-seat majority, no one would give a crap what Matt Gaetz thinks. He'd be as marginalized as you could possibly be.
Where's the good news here?
So here's the good news. And so they've decided to embrace this moment of slim majority and run the caucus, and they were successful in kicking out McCarthy. And I kept wondering, when is our side going to bring a gun to a gunfight instead of a knife to a gunfight, right? And lo and behold, the Brian Fitzpatricks of the world are showing equal courage and saying, okay, if you maybe you can bring down the speaker, but we're not going to let you choose the next speaker. We're not going to let you, nominate somebody who's going to cut off Ukraine and is going to cut off Israel and is going to cut off Taiwan and all the rest of it. We're going to actually say, no, we're not going to elect those people. So, Brian said, I am not going to vote for a speaker who will not pass aid to Ukraine, which is the will of the majority of the House, including most Republicans. And you know what? Good for him. And if he's got 8 people who are willing to do that, then guess what? It's not going to happen. And so I'm glad that somebody and a group of people have been standing up to the Gateses of the world and saying, no, you're actually not the frigging shadow speaker. You're not going to be running this house from these fever swamps where you live. We're actually going to assert ourselves and fight back. And God bless him, and God bless the members who are willing to stand up to the terrorists.
What does Oprah say? You go, girl. You go, guys. Stand up, be courageous, and everybody, thank you for listening. We have been talking a lot about foreign policy, but we do have crises closer to home as well. And so I'm just delighted that Congressman Fitzpatrick was willing to be part of this. Let us know what you think, and take care.
Take care. See you next week. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.